when fourth-generation Montana farmer Thomas Mitchell stands defiantly in front of excavation equipment, tearing into an unmarked ridge on his Pinewood Valley Farm. The ancient artifacts that tumble from the freshly disturbed earth lead to an unprecedented alliance between tribal elders, state officials, and a governor who arrives by helicopter as pipeline executives watch their billion-dollar project grind to a halt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Pinewood Valley Farm as Tom Mitchell guided his weathered John Deere tractor along the perimeter of his wheat fields. Dawn painted the distant Eagle Peak with golden hues that contrasted sharply with the grey clouds gathering on the horizon. At 53, Tom's face carried the weathered lines of a man who had spent his life working the land, his calloused hands testament to 4 decades of planting and harvesting the same soil his great-grandfather had claimed in 1910. The last 3 years of drought had hit the farm hard. The 180 acres that had once provided a comfortable living for the Mitchell family now barely covered the monthly mortgage payments. When the Mountain Valley Energy Corporation had approached him 6 months ago with an offer for pipeline access across the northern edge of his property, the compensation had seemed like a lifeline, enough to upgrade his irrigation system and maybe finally fix the leaking roof on the 1940s farmhouse where he and Sarah had raised their 2 children. Tom slowed the tractor as he approached the northern ridge, an area of elevated land that stretched for about a quarter mile along his property line before disappearing into the old-growth forest beyond. Unlike the rest of his land, this ridge had never been cultivated. His father had been adamant about leaving it untouched, just as his father before him had insisted. Family tradition held that the ground was special somehow, though the specific reasons had faded with each passing generation until only the prohibition remained. "Some land isn't meant for growing crops, Tommy," his father had told him decades ago. "Some land holds different kinds of treasures." As a child, Tom had imagined buried pirate gold or secret caves beneath the ridge. As an adult, he had simply respected his father's wishes without question, assuming it was some outdated superstition or concern about the soil quality. Now, as he watched the line of heavy construction equipment parked along his property boundary, he wondered if he had been too quick to dismiss those warnings. The pipeline surveyors had arrived yesterday, marking a path that cut directly through the ridge. The construction crew had followed at first light, unloading bulldozers and excavators with industrial efficiency. Tom had expected them later in the week, after he'd had a chance to move his cattle to the southern pasture. Climbing down from his tractor, Tom approached the site supervisor, a harried-looking man in his 30s with a bright yellow hard hat and a tablet computer. "Morning," Tom called out over the rumble of diesel engines warming up. "Think there's been some confusion. Wasn't expecting you folks until Thursday." The supervisor, Williams according to his name badge, barely glanced up from his tablet. "Schedule got moved up. We're starting the Riverdale section today. I haven't had a chance to relocate my livestock," Tom explained, trying to keep the irritation from his voice. "And I'm not comfortable with you digging through that ridge without proper surveying." Williams finally looked up, impatience evident, in his clipped tone. "Mr. Mitchell, right? The paperwork's all been filed. Environmental impact assessment is complete. We have the permits and your signature on the right-of-way agreement. We're good to go." Before Tom could respond, the first excavator roared to life, its massive bucket biting into the earth at the base of the ridge. Tom watched in alarm as the machine tore through the ground with mechanical indifference, peeling back the topsoil and exposing the darker earth beneath. "Hold up!" Tom shouted, striding toward the excavator. "You need to stop!" The operator either couldn't hear him over the engine or chose to ignore him. The bucket rose, heavy with soil, and as it swung to deposit its load, something tumbled from the earth, something that caught the morning light with an unnatural gleam. Tom broke into a run, waving his arms. "Stop! Stop the machine!" This time, perhaps sensing the urgency in his voice, the operator paused, the bucket hovering mid-air. Tom reached the freshly dug trench and peered into the exposed earth. What he saw made his blood run cold. Partially uncovered by the excavator's bite was what appeared to be a human bone, unnaturally white against the dark soil. Beside it lay something that glinted in the sun, a piece of intricately carved stone shaped like an eagle with wings spread wide. Even to Tom's untrained eye, it was clearly an artifact of significant age and craftsmanship. "You need to shut this operation down right now," Tom said, his voice steady but firm as Williams approached. "You've disturbed what looks like a burial site." Williams peered into the trench, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern. Could be animal remains, old farm garbage. Tom bent down and carefully brushed away some soil from around the carved eagle, revealing detailed feather patterns that could only be the product of human hands. "This isn't garbage, and those aren't animal bones." Williams hesitated, glancing back at his crew and the line of equipment stretching down the property line. "Let me make a call," he said finally, stepping away with his phone pressed to his ear. Tom remained by the trench, a strange sense of guilt washing over him. His father had protected this ridge his entire life. His grandfather before him had done the same, and Tom had nearly allowed it to be destroyed for a pipeline payout. While Williams conferred with his superiors, Tom used his phone to take several photographs of the exposed artifacts and bones. Then, following an impulse he couldn't quite explain, he called Bobby Redfeather, a Blackfoot elder he'd known for most of his life. Bobby had occasionally helped on the farm during harvest seasons in their younger days, and though they saw each other less frequently now, they maintained a friendship built on mutual respect. "Bobby," Tom said when the older man answered, "I need you to come out to my place. There's something you should see." An hour later, Tom stood at the edge of his property watching a remarkable scene unfold. The construction had halted completely, the idle machines now surrounded by an increasingly diverse group of people. Bobby Redfeather had arrived first, his weathered face solemn as he examined the exposed artifacts. He had immediately recognized their significance and made calls of his own. Now Maya Clearwater, a younger tribal representative who worked as a cultural preservation officer for the Blackfoot Nation, carefully documented each item visible in the disturbed earth. Dr. Eliza Winters, the state archaeologist, had arrived shortly after, bringing specialized equipment and a team of graduate students who were now setting up a perimeter around the site. "This is almost certainly a significant Native American burial site," Dr. Winters explained to Tom as they stood watching her teamwork. "The carved stone eagle is consistent with Blackfoot funerary objects from the pre-colonial period. Based on the artistic style and initial observations, we could be looking at remains that are 500 to 800 years old." Tom nodded, still processing the morning's events. "My family's been farming this land for 4 generations, but we always left this ridge alone. My father used to say it wasn't meant for growing crops. Your family may have known, or at least suspected," Dr. Winters suggested. "It's not uncommon for early settlers to recognize sacred sites, even if the specific knowledge was lost over time." Bobby Redfeather approached them, his expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Our oral histories speak of ancestral grounds in this valley, near where the Blackwater River makes its bend. We always believed most had been destroyed during early settlement." "I had no idea," Tom said, genuine regret in his voice. "If I'd known." Bobby placed a weathered hand on Tom's shoulder. "You stopped the destruction when many would have looked the other way, and your family protected this place even without knowing why." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more vehicles. tribal council members from the Running Water Reservation, representatives from the State Historical Preservation Office, and local news crews who had somehow caught wind of the discovery. The quiet farm had transformed into a hub of activity in just a few hours. James Westfield, a senior executive from Mountain Valley Energy, arrived shortly before noon, accompanied by a legal team and public relations staff. Tom watched as Westfield surveyed the scene with barely concealed frustration before approaching. "Mr. Mitchell," Westfield began, his corporate smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Unfortunate situation. Our team should have conducted more thorough ground surveys." "They shouldn't be digging here at all," Tom replied firmly. "Not now. Not ever." Westfield's smile tightened. "We certainly understand the cultural sensitivity here. Perhaps we can discuss rerouting options that would still allow the pipeline to cross your property in a different location." Before Tom could respond, Maya Clearwater stepped forward. "The entire preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ridge appears to be part of the burial complex. Mr. Westfield, and preliminary ground-penetrating radar suggest the site may extend beyond the visible ridge itself." "We have all necessary permits," Westfield began, "which are invalidated by the discovery of significant cultural artifacts and human remains," Dr. Winters interjected, not looking up from her tablet where she was reviewing initial survey data. "Under both federal and Montana state law, construction must cease pending a complete archaeological assessment." Westfield's corporate demeanor slipped for a moment, revealing the pressure he was under. This pipeline represents $1 billion investment with contractual obligations for delivery. "We cannot simply..." He was interrupted by the distinctive sound of helicopter blades cutting through the air. All eyes turned skyward as a sleek black helicopter with the state seal emblazoned on its side appeared over the tree line, circling, once before setting down in the fallow field adjacent to the ridge. The crowd parted as Governor Patricia Lawson emerged from the helicopter, flanked by aides and security personnel. Despite the impromptu landing in a farm field, the governor looked immaculate in a tailored pantsuit, her silver-streaked dark hair barely disturbed by the helicopter's downdraft. Tom had only seen Governor Lawson on television and during one campaign stop in Riverdale years ago. Her presence on his farm was so unexpected that for a moment he simply stared as she approached, hand extended. "Mr. Mitchell," she said with a firm handshake. "I received calls from both the State Historical Society and the Blackfoot Tribal Council about what's happening here. I wanted to see for myself." "Governor," Westfield stepped forward smoothly, "Mountain Valley Energy appreciates your personal interest in this situation. I assure you, we're committed to working with all stakeholders to find a solution that respects cultural heritage while allowing this vital infrastructure project to proceed." Governor Lawson regarded him coolly. "Mr. Westfield, we'll discuss Mountain Valley's permit compliance later. Right now, I'd like to see what's been uncovered." Dr. Winters led the governor to the excavation site, explaining the preliminary findings, while Maya Clearwater and Bobby Redfeather provided context about the site's likely significance to Blackfoot history and culture. Tom followed silently, still trying to process how his ordinary morning had transformed into this extraordinary gathering. After examining the site, Governor Lawson addressed the assembled group. "Based on what I've seen and the expert assessments provided, I'm issuing an emergency executive order to halt all construction activities within a 1-mile radius of this site, pending a complete archaeological and cultural survey." A murmur ran through the crowd, Westfield stepped forward in protest, but the governor continued. This isn't just about compliance with preservation laws, though those certainly apply. This is about recognizing that our state's heritage belongs to all Montanans, past, present, and future. We have an obligation to protect it. She turned to Tom. Mr. Mitchell, your quick action this morning may have preserved an irreplaceable historical treasure. The state will ensure you don't bear financial hardship for doing the right thing. As the afternoon progressed, the scene at Pinewood Valley Farm grew increasingly organized. State officials established a command post in Tom's barn, while archaeological teams began systematic documentation of the site. Tribal elders conducted a blessing ceremony at the ridge, their voices rising in ancient songs that seemed to Tom strangely fitting for this land his family had worked for generations. By sunset, the national media had arrived, setting up satellite trucks along the farm's access road. Tom found himself giving interviews, telling and retelling the story of his morning discovery and his family's long tradition of leaving the ridge untouched. Sarah arrived home from her job at the Riverdale School District to find their farmhouse surrounded by vehicles and their property transformed into what looked like a cross between an archaeological dig and a media circus. "Tom," she said, finding him sitting alone on their porch steps, watching the activity from a distance. "Jessica from the market texted me something about bones and the governor being here. I thought she was confused." Tom smiled wearily and patted the step beside him. "It's been quite a day, Sarah. Turns out Dad and Grandpa were right about the ridge." As darkness fell over Pinewood Valley Farm, Tom and Sarah sat together on their porch, watching the gentle activity of lights moving around the archaeological site. Teams would work through the night under carefully positioned lights designed to minimize impact on the remains. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her hand finding his in the darkness. Tom considered the question. The day's events had fundamentally altered their circumstances in ways he was still trying to understand. The pipeline that had promised financial salvation would be rerouted. Governor Lawson had made that clear in no uncertain terms. But she had also promised state support, and the tribal council had spoken of partnership opportunities. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, "but I think for the first time in years, I'm not afraid of what comes next." The following morning brought more clarity. Dr. Marcus Chen from the Riverdale Historical Society arrived with preliminary analysis of some of the artifacts that had been carefully removed for conservation. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," Dr. Chen explained, showing Tom photographs of the cleaned eagle carving. "This piece alone would be significant, but the site appears to contain dozens, if not hundreds, of similar ritual objects." Maya Clearwater joined them, carrying a tablet with ground-penetrating radar images. "The survey confirms what we suspected. This isn't just a burial site, it's a major ceremonial complex that appears to have been used for centuries." "On my farm?" Tom said, still struggling to reconcile this revelation with the land he thought he knew so intimately. "Your family may have saved it, even unknowingly," Maya suggested. "When settlers claimed this valley in the late 1800s, many similar sites were plowed under or looted. The fact that your great-grandfather chose to leave the ridge intact and that tradition was maintained through generations." Dr. Chen nodded, enthusiastically. "It's remarkably fortunate. Most archaeological discoveries this significant happen after damage has already occurred during development." That afternoon, a formal meeting was convened in Tom's barn, now cleared of farm equipment, and set up with folding tables and chairs. Governor Lawson presided over a gathering that included tribal leaders, state officials, archaeologists, and representatives from various federal agencies that had become involved. Based on the preliminary assessment, We're designating this site for emergency protection under both state and federal law, announced a representative from the Department of the Interior. The National Register of Historic Places will fast-track its evaluation. Chief Bobby Redfeather spoke next, his dignified presence commanding the room's attention. The Blackfoot Nation proposes a cooperative stewardship arrangement for this sacred site. Mr. Mitchell's family has been unwitting guardians for generations. We wish to formalize and honor that relationship while ensuring our ancestors rest in dignity. Tom listened as a new vision for Pinewood Valley Farm emerged from the discussion. A significant portion of his property, the ridge and surrounding areas, would be placed under a conservation easement, permanently protecting it from development. In exchange, he would receive both compensation and an ongoing role as site steward. The Blackfoot Nation and state of Montana would jointly establish an interpretive center to share the site's cultural and historical significance with the public, creating educational and tourism opportunities that would benefit both the local economy and tribal cultural preservation efforts. Mr. Mitchell, Governor Lawson said, addressing him directly, you had a legal right to allow that pipeline across your property. Many in your position would have looked the other way when artifacts emerged, concerned about their financial future. Your actions reflect the best of Montana's values. Tom shook his head. I just did what seemed right, what my father and grandfather would have expected. As the meeting concluded, Tom stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The ridge that had always been part of his landscape now revealed itself as something far more, a connection to those who had called this valley home centuries before his family arrived. He thought about his great-grandfather, who had somehow recognized something sacred in that ridge, even as he claimed the surrounding land as his own. That respect had passed down through generations as an unquestioned family tradition, a quiet understanding that some places deserve protection even when we don't fully understand why. Sheriff David Harding approached, interrupting Tom's thoughts. Quite the commotion you've stirred up, Tom. Got state troopers helping us manage traffic on County Road 23. Never seen anything like it. Tom nodded. Never expected anything like it either, David. Your daddy would be proud, the sheriff said. He always did say that Ridge was special. Most folks thought Howard was just being superstitious. Turns out he knew something the rest of us didn't. I'm not sure he knew exactly what was there, Tom replied, but he respected what his father had taught him, just like I respected what he taught me. That's how important things survive, the sheriff observed. One generation honoring the wisdom of those who came before, even when the reasons get a little fuzzy. By the end of the week, Pinewood Valley Farm had been transformed. Archaeological teams had established a permanent research station in the North Field. The tribal council had conducted formal ceremonies to honor the ancestors, whose rest had been temporarily disturbed. State officials had completed the paperwork for the conservation easement, ensuring the site's permanent protection. Mountain Valley Energy, facing both legal requirements and public relations concerns, had announced a major reroute of their pipeline, one that would bypass the entire valley. The company had also established a cultural preservation fund as part of their settlement with the state and tribal authorities. For Tom and Sarah, the changes were both practical and profound. The financial compensation from the conservation easement and accompanying stewardship role would secure their farm's future more effectively than the pipeline payment ever would have. Their new position as site co-stewards with the Blackfoot Nation created an ongoing relationship that honored both their families' inadvertent protection of the site and the tribal connection to these ancestral grounds. On Sunday evening, as the week's activities finally quieted, Tom walked alone to the ridge as the setting sun bathed it in golden light. The excavation had been carefully covered and protected, with only a few small research tents indicating the work taking place. The land looked peaceful, much as it always had. Bobby Redfeather joined him, the elder moving silently across the field until they stood side by side, watching the sunset paint the ridge in fiery hues. My grandfather used to tell stories of a sacred council ground where the eagle meets the river, Bobby said after a comfortable silence. For generations, we thought it was just legend, another piece of our heritage lost to history. Tom nodded, and my grandfather insisted this ridge stay untouched, though he couldn't quite explain why. Just family tradition. Perhaps they knew more than they could say, Bobby suggested. Or perhaps some knowledge lives in places deeper than words. I never expected to be the one to discover what my family had been protecting all along, Tom said. I almost let it be destroyed. But you didn't, Bobby reminded him. When the moment came, you honored your ancestors, both yours and mine. And as darkness settled over Pinewood Valley Farm, Tom realized that the land he had farmed his entire life had always held secrets just beneath the surface. The ridge that had been merely a geographic feature was now revealed as a bridge between past and present, between cultures and generations. His family had been part of a story much larger and older than he had ever imagined, unwitting guardians of a heritage that stretched back centuries before they arrived. What had begun as a shocking discovery had transformed into an opportunity for healing, understanding, and preservation that would extend far beyond his lifetime. The ancient burial site, nearly destroyed in a single morning of construction, would now be protected forever. The connection between the Mitchell family and this land had deepened in ways Tom could never have anticipated. Rooted now not just in the 4 generations of his family's stewardship, but in the centuries of history that had preceded them. As Tom turned back toward the farmhouse, lights warm against the gathering darkness, he carried with him a profound sense of continuity, of being one link in a chain of protection that stretched back through time. The true treasure of Pinewood Valley Farm had never been in its wheat fields or the pipeline that might have crossed it, but in the sacred ground his family had instinctively respected, whose significance they had preserved without fully understanding why. Some wisdom, Tom reflected, outlasts the knowledge of its origins. Some responsibilities pass silently through generations, waiting for the moment when their true purpose is finally revealed. Sheriff David Harding's patrol car kicked up clouds of dust as it rolled down the gravel driveway leading to Pinewood Valley Farm. It had been 3 days since Tom Mitchell's discovery had halted the pipeline construction, and what had begun as a local curiosity had exploded into a media sensation that stretched far beyond the borders of Montana. David slowed as he approached Tom's farmhouse, noting the temporary barriers erected at the edge of the property where state troopers now managed access to what the governor had officially designated as a site of extraordinary cultural significance. Television news vans lined the country road, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. Reporters in city clothes stood doing live broadcasts, with the ridge visible in the background, their perfectly coiffed hair incongruous against the rugged Montana landscape. "Morning, Jim," David greeted the state trooper managing the checkpoint. "Tom expecting me." The trooper, borrowed from Billings after the local police force proved insufficient for the growing crowds, nodded. "Said to send you straight up to the house. He's been fielding calls all morning." As David parked beside Tom's weather-beaten pickup truck, he noticed a sleek black SUV with government plates already in the driveway. The farmhouse itself, a modest 2-story structure built in the 1940s, with additions cobbled on by successive generations of Mitchells, seemed dwarfed by the significance of what was unfolding around it. Sarah Mitchell answered his knock, her usually composed features showing signs of strain. A high school history teacher who normally managed crisis with classroom efficiency, she now appeared overwhelmed by the transformation of her home into the epicenter of national attention. "David," she said with obvious relief, "thank goodness, maybe you can talk some sense into these people." The sheriff followed her into the kitchen, where Tom sat at the worn oak table that had served generations of his family. Across from him was a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a tailored suit that shouted federal government. Papers were spread between them, and Tom's expression was a mixture of confusion and wariness. "Tom," David said by way of greeting, "everything all right?" Tom looked up, his weathered face breaking into a weary smile. "David, good timing. This is Special Agent Hernandez from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She's explaining how my farm is now subject to about 15 federal statutes I've never heard of." Agent Hernandez stood, extending her hand to the sheriff. "Catalina Hernandez, I'm here to ensure proper protocols are followed given the significance of the discovery." David shook her hand, noting the firm grip and assessing gaze. "Sheriff David Harding, known Tom here since we were in kindergarten together." "The sheriff's been fielding calls from the county commissioner," Tom explained. "Apparently there's concern about the impact on local infrastructure with all these visitors." Agent Hernandez nodded briskly. "Valid concerns. We're coordinating with state and local authorities to establish a more permanent management structure. This isn't just an archaeological site, Sheriff. Based on preliminary findings, we're looking at one of the most significant discoveries of pre-colonial Native American cultural artifacts in the northern plains in decades." David pulled out a chair and joined them at the table, accepting the mug of coffee Sarah silently offered. "That's all well and good, but this is still Tom's farm, his livelihood, which is precisely why I'm here," Agent Hernandez replied, tapping a document on the table. "The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act provides specific protections for indigenous cultural items and human remains discovered on private land. But it also establishes frameworks for proper compensation to landowners." Tom rubbed his temples, a gesture David recognized from their high school days when his friend was struggling with a particularly challenging math problem. "It's not about money," Tom said quietly. "It's about understanding what this means for my family, for our future here." Agent Hernandez's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, what you've discovered isn't just significant for Native American history. It's significant for American history. Period. The careful preservation of these artifacts, the apparent ceremonial nature of the site, the extent of the complex, it offers an unprecedented window into pre-colonial life in this region." Sarah placed a hand on her husband's shoulder. "We understand the importance, but this has been the Mitchell family home for 4 generations. We need to know what happens next." "That's why I'm here," a new voice interjected. All heads turned to the kitchen doorway where Maya Clearwater stood, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Unlike their previous meetings, where she had been focused entirely on the archaeological work, today she seemed to be on a different kind of mission. "Ms. Clearwater," Tom acknowledged, standing to offer her a chair. "I didn't know you were coming by." Maya accepted the seat, placing her portfolio on the table. "The Tribal Council met through the night. We've developed a proposal we'd like you to consider." David watched as Maya withdrew several documents from her portfolio, noting the official seal of the Blackfoot Nation embossed on the cover page. In his 23 years in law enforcement, he had witnessed countless negotiations between various interests in Riverdale County, water rights disputes, mining claims, development contracts. But he had never seen anything quite like this. "The Tribal Council recognizes that this discovery places a significant burden on your family," Maya began, her voice measured and clear. "We also recognize that the Mitchell family, knowingly or unknowingly, has been stewards of our ancestral grounds for generations." She spread out maps of the farm, overlaid with translucent sheets marking archaeological findings from the past 3 days. The burial complex extends beyond the ridge itself, but not across your entire property. Our proposal is for the Blackfoot Nation to purchase a portion of your land, approximately 40 acres encompassing the archaeological site, at a premium above market value. Tom and Sarah exchanged glances, their silent communication born of decades together. "We're not looking to sell," Tom said finally. "This land isn't just property to us. It's our heritage too." Maya nodded, unsurprised. "We anticipated that response, which is why we've developed an alternative proposal." She turned to a different document, this one bearing the signatures of several tribal elders, including Bobby Redfeather. The Blackfoot Nation proposes a joint stewardship agreement. The land remains in Mitchell family ownership, but with a conservation easement establishing permanent protection for the archaeological site. In exchange, the tribe would provide financial compensation for the easement and establish a cultural center at the edge of the property, creating employment opportunities and educational resources. Agent Hernandez leaned forward with interest. "That's an innovative approach. The BIA could potentially support such an arrangement with additional grants for cultural preservation." "There's more," Maya continued. "The agreement would formally recognize the Mitchell family's 4 generations of inadvertent protection of the site. Tom and Sarah would be named honorary cultural guardians, with Tom employed as the site manager if he wishes, integrating traditional farming practices with archaeological preservation." David watched his friend carefully, seeing the wheels turning in Tom's mind. The proposal was elegant in its acknowledgement of both indigenous rights and the Mitchell family's connection to the land. "This wouldn't affect the rest of the farm?" Tom asked, studying the maps. "You would continue farming as you always have on the remaining 140 acres, Maya confirmed. The easement would only restrict development and certain activities on the archaeological site itself. Traditional, non-mechanical farming could potentially continue even there, with archaeological supervision." Sarah, ever practical, asked. The question David knew was weighing on both Mitchell's minds. "And financially, we need to be honest. We were counting on the pipeline payment to modernize our irrigation system." Maya nodded in understanding. The compensation for the easement would significantly exceed what Mountain Valley Energy offered. Additionally, the cultural center would create permanent revenue streams through tourism and educational programs, with profit sharing for the Mitchell family as site co-stewards. The kitchen fell silent as Tom and Sarah absorbed the proposal. David sipped his coffee, watching his old friend wrestle with a decision that would reshape not just his farm, but his family's legacy in Riverdale County. "I'd need to understand exactly what this means legally," Tom said finally, "for future generations of our family too." "Of course," Maya agreed. "We've prepared detailed documentation, and we fully expect your attorney to review everything. We're committed to ensuring this works for everyone involved." Agent Hernandez gathered her papers. "I'll need to consult with my superiors, but preliminary assessment suggests this arrangement would satisfy federal requirements while respecting both tribal sovereignty and private property rights." As the conversation shifted to logistics and next steps, David excused himself to step onto the front porch. The view from Tom's farmhouse had always been one of his favorite vistas in the county, rolling wheat fields giving way to the darker green of the old-growth forest, with Eagle Peak rising majestically in the distance. Now, with the archaeological teams working methodically across the ridge and media encamped along the road, the landscape seemed forever changed. Bobby Redfeather's truck pulled into the driveway, the tribal elder moving more slowly than in his younger days, but with no less dignity as he made his way toward the house. David met him at the steps. "Sheriff," Bobby acknowledged. "Quite a transformation, isn't it?" David nodded, gesturing at the activity surrounding the farm. Not sure any of us fully understand what's happening yet. Bobby smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. My grandfather used to tell stories about this valley. He said our ancestors held councils where the eagle's shadow touches the river bend. Most of us thought it was just legend, another piece of our heritage lost to time. It turns out he was right, David observed. The old ones often are, Bobby replied. They speak in ways that preserve knowledge even when direct telling might be dangerous or lost in translation. He glanced toward the kitchen window where Tom and Sarah could be seen in serious conversation with Maya. How are they handling it? David considered the question. They're processing. It's a lot to take in. One day you're a farmer worried about mortgage payments. The next, you're at the center of a national historical discovery. Bobby nodded thoughtfully. The Mitchell family has a choice to make. It's not an easy one. Their ancestors made this land productive in their way. My ancestors made it sacred in ours. Now we have an opportunity to honor both traditions. Inside the house, the discussion continued as Bobby joined them, offering cultural context to Maya's proposal. By mid-afternoon, representatives from the governor's office had arrived, along with Dr. Winters and her archaeological team, to present their latest findings. The ground-penetrating radar confirms our initial assessment, Dr. Winters explained, displaying images on her tablet. We're looking at a ceremonial complex that was used consistently over several centuries. The preservation is remarkable, likely because this area was never plowed or significantly disturbed since European settlement. Governor Lawson's representative, a serious-looking man named Richardson, outlined the state's interests. Governor, Lawson believes this discovery represents a unique opportunity for cultural reconciliation and historical preservation. The state is prepared to designate this site as a protected historical landmark and provide matching funds for the cultural center proposed by the Blackfoot Nation. A deal. As the day progressed, what had begun as a bewildering intrusion into Tom and Sarah's quiet farming life began to take shape as something else entirely. A partnership that acknowledged both the ancient history beneath their fields and their family's role in preserving it. By sunset, the kitchen had emptied of officials and experts, leaving Tom and Sarah alone with their thoughts. David had departed to manage a traffic situation at the county line, where curious visitors were creating backups on the rural roads leading to the farm. Agent Hernandez had returned to Helena to brief her superiors, while Maya and Bobby had rejoined the tribal representatives camped respectfully at the edge of the property. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, finding Tom standing at the kitchen window, watching the archaeological teams packing up for the day as darkness fell. "I'm thinking about my father," Tom replied, "and his father before him. How they insisted we leave that ridge alone without ever explaining why." Sarah wrapped her arms around her husband's waist, resting her head against his shoulder. "Do you think they knew about what was buried there?" Tom considered the question, not specifically, but they sensed something. Dad used to say he felt different when he walked across that ridge, like he was being watched. I always thought it was just superstition. Or intuition, Sarah suggested, a respect for something they couldn't quite explain. Tom turned to face his wife of 30 years, the woman who had stood beside him through drought and harvest, through raising children and burying parents, through all the ordinary trials and joys of farm life. "What do you think we should do?" Sarah's response was measured, typical of her thoughtful approach to life's challenges. "I think we need to respect both sets of ancestors, yours who preserved this land without understanding why, and those who made it sacred in the first place. This partnership Maya proposed, it honors both. It would change everything," Tom pointed out. "Our plans, our future." "Life already changed the moment you stood in front of that excavator," Sarah reminded him. "The question is whether we fight that change or find a way to make it meaningful." Tom nodded slowly, his mind returning to the carved eagle figurine that had tumbled from the freshly disturbed earth. He had known in that instant that something profound had been uncovered, something that couldn't simply be reburied or ignored. "I need to walk," he said finally. "Clear my head." Sarah understood, as she always did. "Take your time. This decision isn't just for us. It's for all the Mitchells who came before and all who might come after." Tom pulled on his worn work jacket and stepped into the cool evening air. The farm was quieter now, the daytime commotion replaced by the natural sounds of a Montana spring evening. The distant call of nighthawks, the rustling of wind through newly planted fields. Security personnel maintained a discreet presence. At the archaeological site, their flashlights occasionally sweeping across the ridge like fireflies. His feet carried him along familiar paths, the routes he had walked thousands of times since childhood. He passed the old barn his grandfather had built, its weathered boards containing the history of countless harvests. Beyond it stood the equipment shed where generations of farm machinery had been maintained, adapted, and sometimes invented to meet the specific needs of Pinewood Valley Farm. Eventually, Tom found himself approaching the ridge, its outline just visible in the deepening twilight. Yellow caution tape marked the archaeological perimeter, a modern intrusion on this ancient place. He stopped at the boundary, respecting the temporary barriers without fully understanding why he felt compelled to do so. "Not all treasures reveal themselves immediately," a voice observed from nearby. Tom turned to find Bobby Redfeather standing a few yards away, his silhouette almost merging with the darkness. "I didn't hear you approach," Tom said. Bobby smiled faintly. "Old habits. My grandfather taught me to move quietly through these hills, when I was young enough to listen." Tom gestured toward the ridge. "Your ancestors chose a beautiful place." "As did yours," Bobby replied, "though for different purposes." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two men connected to this land through vastly different traditions that had somehow converged in the present moment. "I'm struggling with what to do," Tom admitted finally. "This farm has been Mitchell land for generations. The idea of changing that." Bobby nodded in understanding. "When Europeans first came to these lands, many of our people faced similar dilemmas. How much to hold to tradition? How much to adapt to new realities? What happened to those who couldn't decide?" Tom asked. "History moved forward regardless," Bobby said simply. "The question was whether they found a way to carry their essential traditions with them or lost themselves entirely in the change." Tom considered this wisdom, recognizing its relevance to his current situation. "The proposal Maya brought today, it's not what I ever imagined for this farm. But it also feels right somehow, like maybe this is what the land has been waiting for." "Perhaps it's what both our peoples have been waiting for," Bobby suggested, "a way to honor the past without being trapped by it." As they continued their quiet conversation beneath the emerging stars, Tom felt a gradual clarity forming in his mind. The decision facing him wasn't really about land ownership in the conventional sense. It was about stewardship, about recognizing that the true value of Pinewood Valley Farm lay not just in its wheat yields or property boundaries, but in its role as a meeting place between cultures and generations. When Tom returned to the farmhouse, Sarah was waiting on the porch swing, wrapped in a quilt against the evening chill. She had always been able to read his expressions, a skill honed through decades of partnership. "You've decided," she observed, as he climbed the steps. Tom nodded, settling beside her on the swing. "I think we need to embrace this change, not fight it." Sarah took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I was hoping you'd say that." "It won't be simple," Tom cautioned. "There will be legal complexities, adjustments to how we farm, public attention we've never wanted." "When has farming ever been simple?" Sarah asked with a gentle smile. We've weathered drought, hail, market crashes, and equipment breakdowns. We'll weather this too. The next morning, Tom called Maya and Bobby to formally accept the partnership proposal, initiating a process that would transform Pinewood Valley Farm into something unique in Montana, perhaps in the entire country. Attorneys would be engaged, documents drafted, boundaries carefully delineated. But the fundamental decision had been made. The Mitchell family would continue as stewards of this land, now in formal partnership with the people whose ancestors had honored it first. Word spread quickly through Riverdale County. Most neighbors expressed support, recognizing the economic potential of cultural tourism in a region where agricultural margins had grown increasingly thin. A few old-timers grumbled about tradition and property rights, but even they acknowledged the significance of what had been discovered. By the end of the week, a formal agreement signing was scheduled, with Governor Lawson herself planning to attend. The event would mark not just a legal arrangement, but a symbolic healing, an acknowledgement that the land's story encompassed both indigenous heritage and settler history. On the morning of the signing, Tom rose before dawn, as farmers have done for millennia. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as he walked the boundaries of his property, 140 acres that would remain in active cultivation, 40 that would now be jointly managed as a cultural and archaeological site. The ridge glowed with the first rays of sunlight as Tom approached, the yellow caution tape removed in preparation for today's ceremony. Archaeological equipment had been temporarily cleared, returning the landscape to a semblance of its natural state. Only the carefully marked excavation sites revealed the extraordinary discoveries that lay beneath. Tom stood at the edge of the ridge, feeling a connection to this land that seemed both utterly familiar and entirely new. For generations, his family had worked around this place, respecting an unspoken boundary without fully understanding why. Now that mystery had been revealed, not as an ending, but as a beginning, a new chapter in the Mitchell family's relationship with Pinewood Valley Farm. As the sun climbed higher, painting the wheat fields gold and the distant forest emerald, Tom heard vehicles approaching. The day's events would soon begin, bringing officials, media, and visitors from across the country. There would be speeches and photographs, signatures and handshakes, the formal machinery of reconciliation and partnership. But in this quiet moment, Tom felt he understood something essential about his family's connection to this land. They had never been its true owners, merely its caretakers for a brief period in its ancient history. The partnership being formalized today wasn't really new at all. It was simply an acknowledgement of something that had always been true. "Ready for the circus?" Sarah asked, joining him at the ridge, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in her hands. Tom accepted one gratefully, the familiar aroma grounding him in the present moment. "As ready as I'll ever be." Sarah surveyed the property, her teacher's eye taking in the preparations for the day's event. "It's strange to think how differently this could have gone if you hadn't been there when they started digging. Or if I hadn't stopped them," Tom acknowledged. "But you did," Sarah said simply. "When it mattered most, you made the right choice." In the distance, they could see the first official vehicles arriving, the governor's motorcade, tribal council members, media vans navigating the gravel access road with urban caution. Soon, their quiet farm would be transformed into a stage for something much larger than themselves. "Whatever happens next," Tom said, "this land will be protected, not just for our lifetime, but beyond." Sarah nodded, understanding the significance of that commitment. For a farmer, there could be no greater legacy than ensuring the land's well-being for future generations. As they walked back toward the farmhouse to prepare for the day's ceremonies, Tom paused for one last look at the ridge, now bathed in full morning light. The ancient burial ground and the fields his family had tilled for generations were part of the same landscape, different threads in a single tapestry that stretched across centuries. In protecting one, he had found a way to secure the other. In honoring those who had come before, he had created a path forward for those who would follow. The treasure buried beneath Pinewood Valley Farm had never been gold or artifacts, but something far more valuable. A connection between peoples and eras, a bridge across time that had waited patiently for the right moment to be discovered. Dawn broke over Pinewood Valley Farm with a spectacular array of purples and oranges that seemed to set the sky ablaze. Tom Mitchell had risen early, as farmers do, but today was unlike any other in his lifetime. Instead of immediately heading to check his fields or tend to equipment, he stood on his porch, watching vehicles arrive along the gravel driveway. State officials, tribal representatives, and media crews assembling for what had become Montana's most significant archaeological event in decades. The governor's office had arranged for the day's meeting to take place at the Riverdale Community Center rather than on the farm itself, a practical decision given the growing number of interested parties. Tom had spent the early morning hours reviewing documents prepared by a lawyer friend from Helena, who had offered his services pro bono, recognizing the complex legal territory the Mitchell family had unexpectedly entered. "You ready for this?" Sarah asked, joining him on the porch with a travel mug of coffee for each of them. Tom accepted the mug gratefully, the familiar aroma providing a momentary anchor to normality. Not sure anyone could be ready for something like this. Sarah studied his face with the understanding that came from 30 years of marriage. "You haven't slept." "Been thinking about my father," Tom admitted, "about all the times he told me to leave that ridge alone, how important it seemed to him without him ever explaining why." "He'd be proud of you," Sarah said, resting her hand on his arm, "for protecting it when it mattered most." Tom nodded, watching as Dr. Winters and her archaeological team resumed their careful documentation of the site, their movements methodical against the backdrop of the morning sun. "Whatever happens in town today, this place will never be the same. We'll never be the same." The drive into Riverdale provided a stark reminder of how dramatically their lives had changed. Local shops had hastily created window displays celebrating indigenous heritage, some thoughtful, others bordering on the inappropriate. News crews from as far away as New York and Los Angeles had established temporary broadcasting positions near the town square. Riverdale, population 2,847, had never seen such attention. The community center parking lot was filled beyond capacity, with additional vehicles lining both sides of Main Street. State troopers directed traffic while local police maintained a perimeter around the building. Tom recognized the governor's official vehicles already parked in reserved spaces near the entrance. Inside, the gymnasium had been transformed into an impromptu conference center. Folding tables formed a large U-shape, with rows of chairs behind them for observers and media. Name placards identified positions for representatives from various agencies and organizations: the State Historic Preservation Office, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Blackfoot Tribal Council, Mountain Valley Energy Corporation, and at the center, Governor Patricia Lawson herself. Tom and Sarah were escorted to seats at the table, their placement between the state officials and tribal representatives symbolic of their unique position in the unfolding situation. Bobby Redfeather nodded in greeting from across the room, while Maya Clearwater approached to briefly review key points they had discussed the previous evening. "Remember," she said quietly, "you have tremendous legal standing here. This is still your property, and that gives you significant influence over what happens next." Before Tom could respond, a side door opened and Governor Lawson entered, followed by her senior staff. The room rose respectfully as she took her position at the center of the table, her presence commanding despite her modest height. At 62, Patricia Lawson had navigated Montana politics for 3 decades, earning respect from across the political spectrum for her straightforward approach to governance. "Please be seated," she began, waiting for the rustling to subside. "I want to thank everyone for assembling on such short notice. What we're addressing today has significant implications, not just for Riverdale County, but for our state's approach to cultural heritage, indigenous rights, and land stewardship." The governor turned her attention directly to Tom and Sarah. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I want to acknowledge that this situation has thrust you into a spotlight you never sought. Your actions in halting the pipeline construction when artifacts were discovered demonstrated the best of Montana values: respect for history and a recognition that some things are more valuable than immediate economic gain." Tom nodded uncomfortably, still unaccustomed to the public attention. Governor Lawson continued, addressing the broader assembly. "We have multiple interests to consider here. The archaeological significance of the discovery is substantial. As Dr. Winter's preliminary report indicates, the cultural and spiritual importance to the Blackfoot Nation is profound. The Mitchell family's multi-generational connection to this land cannot be discounted. And yes, the economic implications of the Mountain Valley Pipeline project affect communities throughout our state." James Westfield shifted in his seat, clearly eager to assert the pipeline's importance, but the governor continued before he could interject. "I've reviewed the applicable state and federal statutes, consulted with experts in cultural resource management, and listened to the initial positions of all stakeholders. Today, I hope we can establish a framework for moving forward that respects all legitimate interests while prioritizing the irreplaceable cultural heritage that has been discovered." For the next hour, representatives from each organization presented their perspectives. Dr. Winters shared preliminary findings that suggested the site contained ceremonial artifacts dating back at least 5 centuries, with burials potentially much older. The ground-penetrating radar indicated the complex extended well beyond the initial excavation, with features aligned to solstice and equinox positions. "In my 23 years of archaeological work in Montana," she concluded, "I have never encountered a site with this degree of preservation or cultural significance. It represents an unprecedented opportunity to understand pre-colonial indigenous life in the Northern Plains." Bobby Redfeather spoke next, his dignified presence commanding attention despite his soft-spoken manner. "For generations, our people carried stories of ancestors who gathered in ceremony where the eagle's shadow meets the river bend. We believed all physical traces had been lost to history and development. What has been discovered on Mitchell land confirms what our elders have always taught, that our connection to this valley extends back countless generations." When James Westfield's turn came, he emphasized the economic impact of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, the jobs it would create, and the company's compliance with all required environmental and cultural surveys prior to construction. "Mountain Valley recognizes the significance of these findings," he said, his corporate demeanor firmly in place. "We're prepared to fund additional archaeological work and to adjust our route to minimize impact on the most sensitive areas. But a complete abandonment of this corridor would have severe economic consequences for communities throughout the state." Throughout these presentations, Tom remained silent, listening carefully and observing the complex dynamics emerging around the table. When finally invited to speak, he rose slowly, acutely aware of the cameras recording his every word. "I'm just a farmer," he began, his voice steady despite his discomfort with public speaking. 4 generations of my family have worked this land since my great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1910. We've weathered drought and flood, market crashes and equipment breakdowns. Through it all, we've tried to be good stewards of the land that sustains us." Tom paused, gathering his thoughts. "My father and grandfather insisted we leave that ridge untouched. They never fully explained why, just that some places weren't meant for plowing. I've come to realize they were preserving something they didn't entirely understand, passing down a respect for that place without knowing exactly what made it sacred." The room was utterly silent as Tom continued. "I signed the pipeline agreement because our farm, like many in Montana, has struggled with rising costs and climate challenges. The compensation offered a way to modernize our irrigation and ensure the farm remained viable for another generation." He looked directly at the tribal representatives, "But what's been discovered changes everything. I cannot in good conscience allow construction that would destroy a site of such significance, not just to the Blackfoot people, but to all of us who value our shared history on this land." Governor Lawson nodded thoughtfully as Tom concluded. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Your perspective is central to resolving this situation." What followed was a detailed discussion of legal frameworks, potential designation options, and competing jurisdictional claims. Federal representatives outlined provisions of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. State officials discussed Montana's cultural resource protection statutes. Tribal lawyers emphasized sovereign rights and cultural heritage claims. Through it all, Tom found himself increasingly drawn to Maya Clearwater's earlier proposal, a partnership approach that would maintain Mitchell family ownership while establishing permanent protections and shared stewardship with the Blackfoot Nation. When a natural break in the discussions came at midday, Governor Lawson called for a lunch recess. "When we reconvene," she announced, "I'd like to focus on concrete proposals for moving forward, approaches that respect all legitimate interests while ensuring permanent protection for this extraordinary cultural resource." As attendees filed out toward the refreshments set up in an adjacent room, Governor Lawson approached Tom and Sarah directly. "Mr. Mitchell, would you and your wife join me privately? There are aspects of this situation I'd like to discuss outside the formal setting." Tom exchanged glances with Sarah before nodding. They followed the governor to a small office off the main gymnasium, where her security detail ensured privacy. Once seated, Patricia Lawson's formal demeanor softened slightly. "I wanted to speak with you directly, without the political and media circus," she began. "What's happening on your farm represents both challenge and opportunity for Montana. How we handle it will set precedents for cultural resource management throughout the state." Tom appreciated her straightforward approach. "Governor, my priority is ensuring our farm remains viable while protecting what's been discovered. Beyond that, I'm navigating unfamiliar territory." Governor Lawson nodded. The proposal Ms. Clearwater outlined, a joint stewardship arrangement between your family and the Blackfoot Nation, offers an innovative approach. It respects private property rights while acknowledging indigenous cultural heritage. From the state's perspective, it could serve as a model for similar situations in the future. "What about Mountain Valley?" Sarah asked. "They're clearly determined to pursue the pipeline." The governor's expression hardened slightly. James Westfield understands political reality. Their environmental impact assessment failed to identify a major cultural site, despite clear indications in historical records of indigenous activity in that valley. They have minimal legal leverage and substantial public relations vulnerability. She leaned forward, her voice lowering confidentially. "Between us, I've already directed my staff to explore alternative pipeline routes that bypass Riverdale County entirely. The state has significant regulatory authority here, and I'm prepared to use it." Tom considered this information, recognizing the political capital the governor was investing in this situation. "What do you need from us?" "Your openness to the partnership approach," she replied directly. "It offers the best balance of interests, permanent protection for the archaeological site, recognition of Blackfoot cultural heritage, and continued Mitchell family presence on the land. The state would support this arrangement with designation on the State Register of Historic Places and potential grant funding for both preservation and agricultural modernization." When they returned to the main meeting an hour later, the discussions had clearly evolved during informal conversations over lunch. Mountain Valley representatives appeared more subdued, while tribal and state officials seemed to have aligned around key principles. Maya Clearwater stood at the front of the room with Bobby Redfeather, prepared to formally present their partnership proposal. Using maps and architectural renderings developed remarkably quickly, Maya outlined a vision for Pinewood Valley Farm that would protect the archaeological site while creating educational opportunities and ensuring the Mitchell family's continued presence. "The proposal has three core elements," she explained, gesturing to the displayed materials. "First, a conservation easement covering the archaeological site and surrounding buffer zone, approximately 40 acres total. This would permanently protect the cultural resources while compensating the Mitchell family at above market value for the development restrictions." She turned to a different map. "Second, continued agricultural use of the remaining 140 acres under Mitchell family management, with potential for integrating traditional indigenous cultivation practices in appropriate areas to create educational opportunities." The final rendering showed a modest structure near the property entrance. Finally, a small cultural center at the edge of the property, creating employment opportunities for both tribal members and local residents, while providing educational resources for visitors and school groups. As Maya concluded her presentation, Bobby Redfeather added an important clarification. "This proposal is not about changing ownership, but about recognizing that this land has always held multiple meanings. To the Mitchell family, it represents 4 generations of agricultural heritage. To our people, it contains ancestral connections dating back centuries. Both perspectives deserve respect and recognition." Governor Lawson allowed time for questions and discussion before addressing the room. "This proposal offers an innovative approach to a complex situation. It respects private property rights while acknowledging indigenous cultural heritage. It creates economic opportunities while protecting irreplaceable historical resources." She turned to James Westfield. "Mountain Valley Energy will need to pursue alternative routing for the pipeline project. The state is prepared to expedite regulatory review of viable alternatives outside the culturally sensitive area." Westfield's expression revealed his frustration, but his response was measured. "We will evaluate our options, including the alternative corridors identified in our preliminary planning. Mountain Valley remains committed to completing this crucial infrastructure project while respecting cultural resources." With remarkable efficiency, Governor Lawson guided the meeting towards specific next steps: formal archaeological designation, legal frameworks for the partnership agreement, funding mechanisms for the cultural center, and a timeline for implementation. By late afternoon, what had begun as a contentious multi-party dispute had transformed into a collaborative planning process. As the meeting concluded, Governor Lawson addressed Tom and Sarah directly. "The Mitchell family has demonstrated exceptional stewardship, both in preserving this site unknowingly for generations and in responding with integrity when its significance was revealed. Montana is grateful." Outside, the media had gathered in force, eager for statements from key participants. Tom found himself standing before a forest of microphones and cameras, Sarah steadfastly at his side. The questions came rapid fire, focusing on the pipeline controversy and archaeological significance. Rather than addressing these directly, Tom spoke from the heart. This land has been Mitchell family land for 4 generations. We've always believed we were its owners, but perhaps we've really been its caretakers all along. What we've discovered beneath our fields connects us to those who honored this valley centuries before our family arrived. He gestured toward Bobby Redfeather and Maya Clearwater, who stood nearby. The partnership we're establishing isn't just about protecting artifacts or respecting legal rights. It's about recognizing that the story of this land includes both our family's agricultural heritage and the much older cultural traditions of the Blackfoot people. Both deserve to be preserved. As reporters continued shouting questions, Tom felt a profound sense of clarity emerging from days of uncertainty. The path forward wouldn't be simple. There would be legal complexities, adjustments to their farming, operations and public attention they had never sought. But the core decision felt unquestionably right, a way to honor both sets of ancestors who had valued this land in their own ways. Later that evening, after the officials and media had finally departed, Tom walked alone to the ridge that had catalyzed such extraordinary changes. The archaeological teams had concluded their work for the day, leaving the site quiet under the emerging stars. Yellow tape still marked excavation areas, and covered shelters protected the most significant findings from the elements. Bobby Redfeather emerged from the gathering darkness, his approach so quiet that Tom started slightly when he spoke. "Beautiful evening," the elder observed, looking toward Eagle Peak silhouetted against the darkening sky. Tom nodded in agreement. "I've seen thousands of sunsets from this farm. Never appreciated how many generations before me witnessed the same view." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, 2 men from vastly different traditions finding common ground in their connection to this particular piece of Montana earth. "My grandfather used to say that land remembers," Bobby said finally, "that it holds the stories of all who have honored it, even when those stories seem forgotten." Tom considered this wisdom, finding truth in it that transcended cultural differences. "Your ancestors made this place sacred through ceremony. Mine protected it through simple respect for tradition. Now we find ourselves working together to ensure it endures." "As it should be," Bobby replied. "The path forward isn't about erasing differences or claiming exclusive rights. It's about recognizing that some places belong to something larger than any of us, that they connect us across time in ways we're only beginning to understand." As darkness settled fully over Pinewood Valley Farm, Tom reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with his simple act of standing before an excavator. His understanding of his family's place in this landscape had been fundamentally transformed, expanded from a narrative of settlement and agriculture to include a recognition of the much older human connections to this valley. The land remained physically unchanged. The same fields his great-grandfather had first plowed, the same ridge his grandfather and father had left untouched. But Tom's perception of it had been irreversibly altered. He now saw it as a palimpsest of human history, with his family's story just the most recent layer in a much deeper cultural record. And in that recognition came not loss but enrichment, a more complete understanding of what it meant to be stewards of this particular piece of Montana earth, connected through it to generations past and those yet to come. The formal partnership agreement would take months to finalize, with lawyers carefully crafting language to protect both Mitchell family interests and Blackfoot cultural heritage. The archaeological designation would bring new restrictions, but also new resources and recognition. The cultural center would transform their quiet farm into an educational destination. Through all these changes, Tom realized, the essential nature of their connection to this land would remain. They would continue to grow wheat on the fields that had sustained 4 generations of Mitchells. They would continue to watch the seasons transform the landscape from the windows of the farmhouse his grandfather had expanded. But now, they would do so with a deeper understanding of their place in the land's longer history, not as its first or only caretakers, but as the most recent in a long line of people who had found meaning and sustenance in this valley where the eagle's shadow meets the river bend. As Tom turned back toward the farmhouse, lights glowing warm against the Montana night, he carried with him a profound sense of having participated in something that transcended ordinary concerns. A reconciliation not just between present interests, but between past and future, between different ways of valuing the same beloved earth. Sarah waited on the porch, her silhouette familiar and comforting against the light spilling from the kitchen. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they had weathered every previous storm in their 30 years of marriage. "You okay?" she asked as he climbed the steps. Tom nodded, surprising himself with the certainty he felt. "For the first time since this all began, I think I am. We're doing the right thing, Sarah. Not just for us, but for everyone who has ever called this valley home." Inside, spread across their kitchen table, were the preliminary plans for the cultural center and the draft conservation easement. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more decisions, more steps toward formalizing the new arrangement. But tonight, in the quiet of their farmhouse, Tom and Sarah Mitchell found peace in knowing that their family legacy had been not diminished, but expanded, connected now to a much older tradition of honoring the land that had sustained them all. The ancient burial ground and the fields their family had tilled for generations were part of the same landscape, different expressions of human connection to a particular place. In protecting one, they had found a way to secure the other. In honoring those who had come before, they had created a path forward for those who would follow. On a crisp autumn morning, 6 months after the discovery that had transformed Pinewood Valley Farm, Tom Mitchell stood at the edge of his newly harvested wheat field, watching the golden sunrise illuminate the ceremonial ridge that had become the center of so much attention. The archaeological tents that had dominated the landscape through spring and summer were now gone, replaced by carefully designed pathways and unobtrusive markers identifying key features of the ancient site. Though scientific work continued, it had evolved from emergency excavation to long-term preservation and study. Today marked the official opening of the Pinewood Valley Cultural Center, a modest yet striking building nestled at the edge of the property where Tom's great-grandfather had first staked his claim over a century ago. The governor would arrive within hours, along with tribal leaders, state officials, and media representatives. But for now, in the quiet dawn, Tom had the farm to himself, a rare moment of solitude to reflect on the extraordinary journey of the past half-year. The wheat harvest had been good, despite the disruptions caused by the archaeological work. The sustainable farming methods suggested by tribal agricultural experts had proven surprisingly effective, integrating traditional knowledge with modern techniques in ways that seemed to reinvigorate soil that had been worked for generations. Tom had approached these suggestions with initial skepticism, but now found himself planning to expand these practices to more fields next season. Thought, "I might find you out here," came Sarah's voice as she approached across the stubbled field, 2 steaming mugs in hand, nervous about today. Tom accepted the coffee gratefully, the familiar aroma grounding him in the present moment. Not nervous exactly, just reflecting. Sarah understood. Throughout their 30 years together, she had always recognized when Tom needed space to process change, and there had been no shortage of change to process. The conservation easement had been finalized 3 months ago, permanently protecting the ceremonial ridge and surrounding buffer zone. while providing the Mitchell family with compensation that had secured the farm's financial future. The formal and partnership with the Blackfoot Nation had established a governance structure balancing landowner rights with indigenous cultural heritage, creating a model that was already being studied by communities facing similar situations across the West. Bobby called. Sarah said after a comfortable silence. The elders completed their sunrise ceremony. They'll join us at the cultural center by 10. Tom nodded, picturing the tribal elders conducting their private rituals at the sacred site, just as their ancestors had done centuries before his family arrived in this valley. What had once seemed foreign, even intrusive, now felt like a natural part of the farm's rhythms, a reclaiming of traditions that belonged to this land as surely as the seasons themselves. "Have the school buses arrived yet?" he asked, thinking of the educational programming that had become central to the cultural center's mission. "First groups arrive at 11 after the official ribbon cutting," Sarah replied. As a teacher herself, she had been instrumental in developing curriculum that would bring students from across the region to learn about both indigenous heritage and agricultural history. Jessica from the Tribune is already setting up, says national outlets are sending crews too. The media attention had never fully subsided, though it had evolved from sensationalized coverage of the pipeline controversy to more thoughtful exploration of the partnerships emerging from the discovery. Documentary filmmakers had spent weeks capturing oral histories from both tribal elders and local farming families, weaving together perspectives that had been artificially separated by centuries of historical division. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Tom noticed the growing line of vehicles along the access road, early arrivals for the day's ceremony, setting up equipment and preparing the site. Among them was Dr. Eliza Winter's familiar university van, the archaeologist having become almost family over months of close collaboration. "Tom!" she called, waving a folder as she approached. "The final dating analysis came back from the lab last night. I thought you'd want to see it before the formal presentation." Tom had developed a genuine interest in the scientific aspects of the discovery, finding unexpected common ground between archaeological methodology and the practical problem-solving he'd applied throughout his farming career. "What did they find?" Dr. Winters opened the folder, revealing charts and graphs that had become increasingly comprehensible to Tom over months of involvement. The ceremonial use of the site spans nearly 8 centuries, with the most intensive period corresponding exactly to the oral histories Bobby shared about a spiritual renewal movement among the Blackfoot people around 1500. But here's what's truly remarkable. She pointed to a specific section of the analysis. The site was abruptly abandoned around 1780, likely due to the smallpox epidemic that devastated indigenous populations throughout the region. But these findings suggest at least some ceremonial activity resumed briefly around 1870, just before European settlement intensified. Tom absorbed this information, his mind immediately calculating the timeline. That would be right before my great-grandfather arrived in 1910. Exactly, Dr. Winters confirmed, which raises interesting questions about whether the early Mitchell family might have had direct contact with Blackfoot people still using the site for ceremonial purposes, perhaps leading to the family tradition of leaving the ridge untouched. This possibility that his ancestors might have known more than family law had preserved had occurred to Tom before. It would explain the unusually specific prohibition against disturbing the ridge, passed down through generations without explanation. Perhaps his great-grandfather had made promises now lost to time, commitments honored through action, even after their origin was forgotten. By mid-morning, Pinewood Valley Farm had transformed from a working agricultural operation to the venue for what Montana newspapers were calling a historic reconciliation. The newly completed cultural center stood ready for its official opening, its architecture harmonizing with both the natural landscape and the agricultural structures that had defined the property for generations. Governor Patricia Lawson arrived. Precisely at 9:30, her motorcade pulling up to the designated area with characteristic punctuality. Unlike previous visits, today's appearance was fully official. Security details, staff assistance, and the formal trappings of state government. Yet when she approached Tom and Sarah waiting at the entrance, her handshake was warm and genuine. "The Mitchell family," she said with a smile, "proof that ordinary citizens doing the right thing can change the course of history." Tom shook his head modestly. "We just protected what was already there, Governor. What our family had been protecting without fully understanding why." "Which is precisely what makes this story so powerful," she replied. "It cuts through the artificial divisions we've created between settler history and indigenous heritage, revealing how interconnected our stories have always been." The governor's perspective reflected the evolving narrative that had emerged around the Pinewood Valley discovery. Not a story of conflict between competing claims, but of recognition that the land itself contained multiple layers of history deserving equal respect. This framing had helped transform what could have been a divisive local controversy into a model for collaborative preservation that respected both private property rights and indigenous cultural heritage. At 10 o'clock, the formal ceremony began. A temporary stage had been erected near the cultural center entrance, with seating for dignitaries and media positioned to frame both the new building and the sacred ridge in the background. Tom found himself on this stage alongside Sarah, feeling distinctly out of place in his best suit, rarely worn since their daughter's wedding 3 years earlier, yet understanding the symbolic importance of his presence. Bobby Redfeather opened the proceedings with a traditional blessing in the Blackfoot language, followed by its English translation. His dignified presence embodied the living connection between ancient traditions and contemporary life, between the ancestors whose remains had been discovered and the modern tribal members reclaiming their heritage. For generations, our people carried stories of this sacred place, Bobby explained to the assembled crowd. We believed all physical traces had been lost to history and development. What has been discovered here confirms what our elders have always taught, that our connection to this land endures even when temporarily invisible to the eye. Governor Lawson spoke next, placing the Pinewood Valley Partnership in the context of broader efforts toward cultural reconciliation throughout Montana. What began as an accidental discovery has evolved into an intentional model for how we can honor multiple dimensions of our shared heritage. The Mitchell family's immediate protection of these artifacts, followed by their openness to partnership with the Blackfoot Nation, demonstrates the best of Montana values. When Tom's turn came to speak, he approached the microphone with the straightforward manner that had characterized his response throughout. No prepared remarks, just the authentic voice of a farmer whose understanding of his land had been profoundly transformed. "I'm just a farmer," he began, echoing the words he had used at the first community meeting 6 months earlier. "4 generations of my family have worked this land since my great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1910. We've always believed we were its owners, but perhaps we've really been its caretakers all along." Tom gestured toward the ridge visible, behind the assembled crowd. "My father and grandfather insisted we leave that ridge untouched. They never fully explained why, just that some places weren't meant for plowing. Now I understand they were preserving something they didn't entirely comprehend, passing down a respect for that place, without knowing exactly what made it sacred." He turned toward the tribal representatives seated on the stage. "The partnership we're establishing isn't just about protecting artifacts or respecting legal rights. It's about recognizing that the story of this land includes both our family's agricultural heritage and the much older cultural traditions of the Blackfoot people. Both deserve to be preserved." The ceremony continued with Maya Clearwater and Dr. Winters presenting the scientific and cultural significance of the discoveries, followed by the formal ribbon cutting for the cultural center. As planned, the honor of cutting the ribbon was shared between Tom, Bobby Redfeather, and Governor Lawson, a symbolic representation of the partnership between private landowners, indigenous peoples, and state authorities that had made preservation possible. Inside, the cultural center's exhibits reflected this integrated approach to the land's history. Traditional display cases housing carefully preserved artifacts stood alongside interactive exhibitions on sustainable agriculture. Blackfoot. Language recordings shared space with oral histories from long-time farming families. A central gallery featured a timeline that placed the Mitchell family's 4 generations within the much longer continuum of human presence in the valley, contextualizing rather than diminishing their contribution. By 11, the first school, groups began arriving. Children from Riverdale Elementary, where Sarah had taught for decades, followed by students from the tribal school on the Running Water Reservation. Tom watched as these young people, representing different communities that had often remained separate despite their geographical proximity, moved through the exhibits together, their natural curiosity transcending the historical divisions that had shaped their elders' perspectives. "This is the real achievement," Bobby observed, joining Tom as he watched the children. Not just protecting what was buried in the past, but planting seeds for a different future. The observation captured something essential about what had emerged from the Pinewood Valley discovery. Not merely preservation of physical artifacts, but cultivation of new understanding that might yield harvests for generations to come. Like the careful farmer Tom had always been, the partnership had focused not just on immediate needs, but on long-term sustainability, on nurturing relationships that would outlast any single season. As the formal events transitioned to public tours and educational programming, Tom found a moment to slip away from the crowds. He walked the familiar path toward the ridge, now marked with interpretive signage, explaining its significance from both archaeological and cultural perspectives. The harvested fields stretched around it, golden stubble catching the autumn sunlight, while the careful excavations had been stabilized and protected for ongoing research. Maya Clearwater joined him, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the landscape. Over months of collaboration, they had developed a friendship grounded in mutual respect and shared commitment to the land's well-being, despite coming from traditions that historical circumstances had often placed in opposition. "When I was in college studying cultural preservation," she reflected, "the cases we studied were almost always adversarial. Indigenous communities fighting legal battles against development, private landowners, or government agencies. What's happening here feels like something new." Tom nodded, understanding what she meant. Or maybe something very old, just rediscovered. People finding ways to share land rather than divide it. "The elders say that wisdom often moves in cycles," Maya replied. "Old knowledge forgotten, then remembered when the time is right." This cyclical understanding of wisdom resonated with Tom's experience as a farmer, where practices sometimes circled back to older methods after the limitations of newer approaches became apparent. The indigenous agricultural techniques he had initially regarded skeptically had proven to be sophisticated adaptations to the specific conditions of this region, developed through centuries of careful observation and passed down through generations of practical experience. By afternoon, the formal ceremony had concluded, and Governor Lawson had departed for engagements elsewhere in the state. The media began packing up their equipment, having captured the images and sound bites that would frame the story for wider audiences. The cultural center remained open, staffed by a combination of tribal members and local volunteers, trained to guide visitors through the exhibits. Tom returned to the farmhouse, removing his uncomfortable suit and changing back into the work clothes that formed his everyday uniform. Despite the momentous nature of the day's events, there were still farm tasks requiring attention. Equipment maintenance, preparing fields for winter, planning for next season's planting. The ceremonial significance newly recognized on his land didn't diminish its practical function as a working farm. Rather, the two dimensions had become integrated aspects of the same landscape. Sarah found him in the equipment shed, methodically servicing the combine harvester that had completed its work for the season. She had also changed from her formal attire back into practical clothing, though traces of the day's ceremonial makeup remained on her face. "The governor's cultural affairs director called," she said. "They've approved the additional funding for the educational program. We can expand to accommodate school groups from across the state starting next spring." Tom nodded, pleased, but not surprised. The Pinewood Valley Partnership had quickly become a political success story embraced across party lines, conservatives appreciating its respect for private property rights and agricultural tradition, progressives valuing its recognition of indigenous heritage and environmental protection. Governor Lawson had leveraged this broad support to secure resources ensuring the program's sustainability beyond initial grant funding. "Did you see James Westfield was there?" Sarah added, referring to the Mountain Valley Energy executive, whose pipeline project had inadvertently triggered the entire sequence of events. Tom hadn't noticed the executive among the many visitors. "Seems unlikely he came to celebrate." Sarah smiled. "Actually, he was quite gracious. Said the company is exploring partnership opportunities with the Cultural Center, educational programming about responsible energy development alongside cultural preservation. Maya thinks there might be genuine opportunities there if we're careful about maintaining independence." This potential for collaboration with the very corporation whose construction equipment had threatened the site demonstrated how thoroughly the narrative had evolved. What had begun as adversarial positions had gradually transformed into recognition of shared interests in sustainable regional development that respected both economic needs and cultural heritage. As evening approached, most visitors had departed, leaving the farm quieter than it had been in months. The cultural center staff completed their closing procedures, securing artifacts and exhibitions for the night. Research teams packed their equipment, though the carefully protected excavation sites remained available for ongoing study under the agreements established in the conservation easement. Tom and Sarah hosted a small gathering at their farmhouse for those most intimately involved in the project. Bobby Redfeather and several tribal elders, Dr. Winters and her key researchers, Maya Clearwater, and the Cultural Center Development team. The informal dinner featured food from both traditions. Sarah's famous beef stew, alongside traditional indigenous dishes prepared by tribal members. Conversation flowed easily among people who had become partners and friends through months of collaboration. Dr. Winters shared plans for the comprehensive archaeological monograph being prepared for academic publication. Maya outlined upcoming educational programs for the winter months when school visits would move primarily indoors. Bobby and the elders told stories that had been passed down through generations, many referring to landmarks within the valley that had been renamed during European settlement, but were now being reconnected to their original cultural context. As the evening progressed, talk turned to the future, not just the immediate plans for the cultural center or archaeological research, but the longer legacy of what had been established at Pinewood Valley Farm. The conservation easement would protect the site in perpetuity, while the partnership agreement created governance structures designed to outlast any individual participant. The educational programs would influence young people who might carry these lessons of collaboration into future challenges. What happens if your children don't want to continue farming? One of the younger tribal representatives asked Tom. Does the partnership continue? It was a practical question that touched on deeper concerns about long-term sustainability of the arrangement. Tom and Sarah exchanged glances, having discussed this extensively during the legal drafting process. The easement and partnership agreement run with the land, not with our family specifically, Tom explained. If our children choose different paths, the protected status remains regardless of who owns the farm. But truthfully, I think this discovery has actually strengthened our family's connection to this place, not weakened it. Sarah nodded in agreement. Our daughter Jennifer calls weekly now to discuss the project. She's talking about eventually moving back from Seattle with her family, perhaps building a small house on the western section. This place means more to her now, not less. This multi-generational perspective had been central to designing the partnership, just as the Blackfoot people thought in terms of 7 generations when making significant decisions. The Mitchell family had approached the agreement not just as current landowners, but as links in a chain stretching backward and forward through time. As the gathering concluded and guests departed into the cool autumn night, Tom and Sarah stood on their porch, watching headlights trace paths down the gravel driveway toward the main road. The stars had emerged in full brilliance, the clear Montana sky offering the same celestial panorama that had inspired the ancient builders of the ceremonial structures now protected beneath their fields. "Quite a day," Sarah observed, leaning against Tom's shoulder in the familiar gesture of partners who had weathered countless challenges together. Tom nodded, his arm automatically finding its place around her waist. "Quite a 6 months." The transformation had been profound, not just of the farm's physical landscape, but of their understanding of their place within it. What had begun with a simple act of halting construction equipment had evolved into a reimagining of their family's relationship to this land, not diminishing their agricultural heritage, but enriching it with recognition of the much older human connections that had preceded them. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last visitors' vehicles disappear beyond the property boundary. Tomorrow would bring a return to more normal routines, farm work, school responsibilities, the practical tasks that structured their lives. But those familiar activities would now take place within a landscape whose meaning had been fundamentally expanded, whose story had revealed itself to be far richer and more complex than they had previously understood. When Tom had first encountered the carved eagle and human remains unearthed by the pipeline excavator, he could never have imagined the journey that discovery would initiate. What might have been a devastating loss of the pipeline payment they had counted on, of their uncontested authority over their land, of the straightforward narrative that had defined their family's place in local history, had instead become an unexpected gift. Financial security through the conservation easement, enriched understanding of their property's significance, and a more complex but ultimately more meaningful connection to the land they had always loved. As they turned to enter the farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of Mitchells, Tom paused for one final look at the ridge silhouetted against the starlit sky. The land itself remained unchanged in its essential nature, the same soil his great-grandfather had first plowed, the same elevation his grandfather and father had left untouched. But his perception of it had been forever altered, expanded to encompass its deeper history and multiple meanings. In protecting the ancient burial ground, he had discovered a more profound understanding of his family's agricultural heritage. In honoring those who had come before, he had created a path forward for those who would follow. The treasure buried beneath Pinewood Valley Farm had never been gold or artifacts, but something far more valuable, a connection between peoples and eras, a bridge across time that had waited patiently for the right moment to be discovered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.